Welcome to Glencoe Public Library's program, Patterns of Mexico. Our presenter tonight is Gilberto Sandoval. Gilberto is the lead art educator for the National Museum of Mexican Art. The museum was organized as the Mexican Fine Arts Center Museum in 1982 by Carlos Tortolero and opened its doors in 1987. Its goal was to be an arts and cultural organization committed to accessibility, education, and social justice. It also provided a positive influence for the local Mexican community, especially as many other art institutions did not address Mexican art. In 2001, the museum expanded to a state-of-the-art facility in the Pilsen neighborhood, and in 2006 was renamed the National Museum of Mexican Art. If you have not been to the National Museum of Mexican Art, I strongly encourage you to check it out. It's only a 37-minute drive from Glencoe, but it will make you feel as if you've traveled a lot farther. Gilberto, thank you so much for coming here tonight, and I will let you take it from here.
Yeah, hello everyone. Buenas noches, buenas tardes, hello. Good evening. My name is Gilberto Sandoval Rubalcava. I am the lead art educator at the National Museum of Mexican Art. Before we get started, quick museum plug, of course. The National Museum of Mexican Art is one of the few free admission institutions of Chicago. We are a completely free admission art museum. We're located, as was mentioned, in the Pilsen neighborhood, 1852 West 19th Street. And once you visit the museum, not only do you get to see all the beautiful artwork that we have on display and the incredible facility that we've created, but also the neighborhood. Pilsen is one of the largest Mexican-American neighborhoods in the city of Chicago and in the Midwest and possibly the United States, certainly the Midwest. And the beauty of Pilsen is that in and of itself, the neighborhood is sort of a gallery as well. There's a ton of murals all over the neighborhood. On one street alone, on 16th Street, it's like a almost 2-mile stretch of mural corridor. And then within the immediacy of the museum, there's a ton of murals as well. And of course, Mexican food is delicious, and we have really delicious Mexican food in Pilsen. So come on down and make it, I think, a day if you can. So you can hang out in the neighborhood, eat some food, and check out the National Museum of Mexican Art. I am going to speak to you about this topic, Patterns of Mexico, which will be a highlight of several art forms, 3 really particularly iconic and emblematic art forms of Mexican art. In Mexico, we are very fortunate to have like a rich tapestry of culture and visuals and art. And these 3, I think, are some of the most recognizable. And even within the incredible artwork that we have in Mexico, they stand out quite boldly. So Patterns of Mexico is a presentation where I'm going to speak to you all about Talavera Poblana, Papel Picado, and Huichol votive art. Huichol is a terminology to refer to an indigenous community who refer to themselves as Huixarica. Is probably a more appropriate term. Huichol is more of like an outsider thrusted upon them term, but it's also the more recognizable term, unfortunately. But Huixarica votive art or Huichol votive art are one of the 3 patterns that I'll be speaking about today. On the left, we have this votive art form, the Huixarica art form. On the top right-hand side, we have the Talavera, and on the bottom right, we have Papel Picado. Probably you have seen some of these, if not all of these art forms at some form, in some capacity, whether it be here in the city of Chicago or if you've traveled to Mexico and Mexico. Patterns are of course, these regular repeating or orderly arranged. A pattern is a regular repeating or orderly arrangement of elements such as shapes, colors, or behaviors from a consistent, predictable structure. They're not unique to Mexico. Patterns are something that appear in art form all over the world and in nature. There's patterns in this room right now. There's patterns on our face. There's patterns everywhere. Using patterns in art form is also not unique to Mexico, but it's these patterns that are unique to Mexico and the way that we navigate those patterns. And more importantly, the history behind these patterns, I think, speaks so much. Every time we see these art forms, there's a lot of information that went into creating them not just in the immediacy, but historically speaking, there's a lot of information and a wealth of information constantly being thrown at us in Mexico. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, we're a little bit more familiar with some of those things. While I was doing the research for the presentation and assembling the images, I thought of this question: how do patterns carry memory, belief, and identity across generations? How is it that this art form has become so emblematic, and what is it about those art forms that make them so representative of Mexican culture, not just visually, but historically, culturally, emotionally, etc.? We're going to start with one of my favorite art forms in Mexico, Talavera Poblana. This art form has kind of a bonkers history and sort of a crazy journey to Mexico. Although it is now emblematic of Puebla and this region in and around the state and the cities of Puebla, Talavera Poblana has kind of an incredible journey. Like many things, it does not start in Mexico. Like many Mexican things that we identify today, it doesn't start in Mexico. It starts in... Oh, sorry, this is where it's from in Mexico. This is the region of Puebla. Talavera Poblana can only come from the area inside of that little red circle. And the reason for that is because it's made specifically of specific soil, and it's made with very specific processes. And in order to protect the soil and those processes, Talavera Poblana is protected by guilds. So only specific artists that are guild recognized can produce true Talavera Poblana. And that can only happen in this little region of Mexico. What does Talavera Poblana look like? It looks like this. In mercados all over Puebla, you'll see these kinds of plates, this kind of earthenware. They're a kind of porcelain that is made with specific earths from Mexico. They have these polychrome glazes, and they're very famously using these white inks. In Mexico, we also use yellow, orange, reds, sometimes blacks, not as often, and a couple of other colors that are used, usually coming from natural pigments in the region, specifically minerals from in and around this region, to create these pigments and create these dyes, create these pieces. Talavera Poblana is one of the beautiful art forms in Mexico that also can have a very functional use, which means that historically speaking, it was very common to see it in like a kitchen and like people's backsplashes. As time has gone on and art markets have exploded, it's kind of expensive now to purchase, especially real Talavera. But at some point in Mexican history, it was pretty common to see it as a normal cup. If you were going to buy a cup, why not just buy the pretty cup? So it was very common to see it because of this functional use. How does Talavera get to Mexico? Like I mentioned, like many things that we have in Mexico, it doesn't necessarily start in Mexico. Unlike many things in Mexico, though, it doesn't start exactly in Spain. It starts in China, in the far western regions of China. China has been the birth of many human innovations, some things like paper, which we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, but also ceramic, and more specifically porcelain. 20,000 years ago, there are the findings of the first ceramic vessels in China. Or I should say the first ceramic vessels found in Earth, the human ceramic vessels, are found in China, and they're about 20,000 years old. Over the course of their history, Chinese ceramicists developed porcelain. Porcelain is a much finer, much thinner, and because of the process of glazing and high kiln technology, they managed to create these very white, a white that had never been seen before up until the creation of Chinese porcelain. They made it available to the market. This incredible technological advance really changed the landscape of what pottery could be. It's much thinner, it's much stronger, it's really pale and white and pretty and pristine and ethereal. And that, of course, immediately becomes a luxury good, not only because it's amazing to look at, but compared to other earthenware of its era, this was more hygienic. It was less porous, so it was less permeable, meaning it was more waterproof. And at the height of the Tang Dynasty in about 600 to 900 after Christ, it became an incredible commodity and a luxury good. That luxury good, like many luxury goods, traveled westward from China to present day southeastern Asia, to southeastern Asia, in places that we would more commonly refer to like the Middle East. In these regions, of course, the vessels from China start to travel westward, but like most people that are using the Silk Road to travel with goods, you don't want to constantly buy stuff from the people that are selling it to you. Sort of the beauty of trade is that eventually you learn how to make the things that you're buying, and you learn to make them whether in your own style or with your own goods. And in southeastern Iraq, we get artisans and sculptors that start to mimic the porcelain tradition with Iraqi-based earthenware. They mimic this process of the white glaze, but they add something that's very Persian. They add this blue cobalt dye. The blue cobalt dye in the Middle East was something that was already being used. It's something that was added to this white ceramic glaze through the Silk Road. It goes back to China. There it is, going back to China. And of course, Chinese ceramicists incorporate this blue dye, blue ink, this cobalt-based blue ink that comes from Iraq, or present-day Iraq, in Chinese visuals. So now we have a Chinese pottery style with Middle Eastern influence, Iraqi influence, and Chinese symbolism. Again, through trade, it goes back and forth, until the Moorish army of the northern Africa and all of their wealth of Islamic culture decide to conquer the Iberian Peninsula. The Silk Road gets these porcelain goods to the Middle East through the Moorish conquest of Spain. It gets to the Iberian Peninsula. The Islamic armies ruled Spain for 700 years, from the year 711 to the year 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. This ruling of Spain meant that over the course of 700 years, there was this pretty intense cultural fusion of Iberian culture and Islamic culture. So much so that in this specific region of Spain, the province of Toledo, there was a town called Talavera. In this town, just like in Iraq, just like in this region of China, there was strong earthenware. There was really good clay to make porcelain goods. There was the minerals to create that white glaze. They were learning the blue dye from the Middle Eastern cobalt blue dye. And they started to decorate their spaces with Catholic imagery in this Spanish Catholic town, with a originally Chinese pottery style, now with Islamic influence, now using Catholic symbolism and European symbolism. In the spirit of conquest, the Spanish oust the Islamic rule of Spain, and they conquer, or they travel westward to the Americas, to present-day Americas. And so this white pottery style goes from China, Western China, to Southeastern Asia, goes to Spain via the Moorish conquest of Spain, and then in 1519 it arrives at the eastern coast of Mexico in present-day Veracruz. The Spanish conquest of Mexico is sort of one of the most cataclysmically changing moments in global history. Not only does it shrink the world basically by 50%, it also introduces, for the first time ever, a notion of a globalized culture. There starts to be these moments where the goods from the quote-unquote old world start to travel to the new world, and vice versa. Today, when we eat Italian food, chances are there's some kind of tomato sauce in it. Tomatoes are from the Americas. Before the conquest of the Americas, Italian food was tomato-less. All food in Europe was tomato-less. Potatoes are from the Americas. Chocolate is from the Americas. All of these things that we recognize now as like globally common, they're originally from the Americas. Before the conquest in present-day Mexico, there was already a rich culture of ceramicists, of earthenware products, of clay pottery, and particularly in this region of present-day Puebla, the Mixteca Poblana cultures had a really strong, really beautiful earthenware. The minerals, the earth of that area lend itself to some really fine craftsmanship. And as a result of the availability of material, those craftsmen were really skilled. When the Spanish conquer Mexico, they find really talented artists, really talented ceramicists. And over the course of the ensuing few hundred years immediately after the conquest, the Spanish are like, well, we've defeated the Aztec Empire and all other empires. We've decimated the population via smallpox and other gross diseases. Let's build churches. And let's build churches with the kind of stuff we like to see in Spain. And so, to avoid, of course, import taxes, presumably, and to avoid having to lug ceramics from Spain to Mexico, across the Atlantic Ocean. The Spanish ceramicists, they build guilds here in Mexico, in and around these regions with like high soil, high mineral concentration, specifically around Puebla. And in the 1500s, the mid 1500s, we start to see the first ceramicist guild specifically dedicated to Talavera, which comes from the name of this town in Spain, using this Chinese porcelain white glaze technique, using Middle Eastern cobalt blue with Catholic imagery, being built with Mexican soil here in Mexico. And they start to decorate churches. This is the facade of San Francisco de Acatepec, San Francisco de Acatepec. It's a really beautiful church, and as you can tell, it's completely covered in this Talavera style from Mexico. Even though it comes from this very rich cultural fusion, it's visibly pretty identifiably as Mexican. For one, as you may have noticed, the other ceramic styles don't implement as much color as we do here in Mexico. The greens and the reds are significantly less common in other versions of this kind of pottery style. And it's made specifically with that kind of porcelain clay that comes from the region of Puebla. This is a piece that we have in our collection at the National Museum of Mexican Art. It is titled Vase Depicting Chinese Imagery. It's from the 17th century. It was made in colonial Mexico, probably in and around Mexico City. And it's one of my favorite pieces of art because I'm a big fan. I don't know what this says about me politically or personally, but I'm a big fan of bootlegging. I love to make imitation things, and I love when imitation things are done great, like great imitations. They fascinate me. And this is it's a fake Mexican ceramicist now working with this originally Chinese, then with Islamic influence, then with Spanish influence, now in Mexico. Because of the globalization, because of the transoceanic trades, goods from China were traveling through the Pacific Ocean. They would land in the western coast of Mexico via carriages. They'd be taken to Mexico City. From Mexico City, they'd be packaged and reshipped to Spain, where the wealthy people were residing. Mexican ceramicists were like, whoa, check out these pieces from China. These are cool. We can make these and sell them as Chinese products. So this is a piece from Mexico that was probably intended to be sold to Spaniards or at least to wealthy people in Mexico, with erroneously created Chinese imagery, using this incredibly intense cultural fusion of artwork. And we have this on display at the National Museum of Mexican Art if you guys are curious to check it out. Again, it's a Mexican pottery depicting Chinese imagery made with a Spanish style version of an Islamic version of a Chinese version of pottery. And we have it in Chicago. Papel Picado. Papel Picado is one of the other topics that I wanted to speak about today. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this kind of artwork. Papel Picado now is used sort of synonymously with any sort of Mexicanism. If you've been to like a Mexican grocery store or a Mexican restaurant, chances are you've seen this kind of decoration hanging from ceilings. In Mexico, we see Papel Picado frequently for Dia de los Muertos, for Day of the Dead. And in some regions of Mexico, Papel Picado is spoken about as a portal or the entry point for the souls of our loved ones to enter this reality. And so it's important to suspend it over altars and over cemeteries during Day of the Dead. However, because it's used so synonymously with Mexican cultural celebrations, it exists very frequently outside of the context of Day of the Dead. Whatever the case may be, however it's used, it always has this, it's very temporary. It's a super temporary kind of decoration. They're made typically of tissue papers. Tissue paper in Mexico is called papel de China, paper from China. And it's one of the many evolutions of this globalized world in the colonial period of Mexico. Today we'll see it all over Mexico, and it has all of these incredible visuals and incredible patterns, but it has a really interesting history as well in Mexico. I think this like temporary aspect of it, like transience of papel picado, is also like a really important notion to have. We hang these really beautiful, really intricate, really detailed decorations, and we hang them in these public spaces for everyone to enjoy. But they're made of very fragile, very thin paper. A strong gust of wind, slight rain will completely disintegrate the paper. That's part of the beauty, and it's part of like what makes it so special, is that it's only up for a little bit. Just as we're only here for a little bit, the papel picado is only up for a little bit. Papel picado, like many other things in the world, originates in China. There was an archaeological find that found a version of a sort of papel picado, this like perforated paper, this cut paper, that was dated to China, and it was dated 100 years after Christ or so about 2,000 or 1,900 years old. And it is incredible that it was discovered and that it's preserved. Paper is super fragile. Any slight moisture, any change in temperature can destroy paper. So the fact that it was discovered is pretty great. Paper also has a rich history in China, and specifically the processes of papers that we use still to this day. A lot of them were developed in China. So much so that in Mexico we still call tissue paper papel de China. Mexico, however, also had a rich tradition of paper making. Before the arrival of European powers, before the arrival of Hernan Cortés and the Spanish Catholics, Mexico and the indigenous communities of Mexico already had a process of making paper. We call it today papel amate, A-M-A-T-E. Papel amate, paper is papel. Papel amate is a type of paper that is made with tree bark. It is a kind of paper that is specific to Mexico, specific to the central regions. It's made usually from the bark of a tree. You debark a tree, you soak that bark in water, which is what they're sort of drying the bark after it's been soaked, or preparing it for soaking. In Mexico, during the height of the Aztec Empire, so the Aztecs ruled what is present-day Mexico City from around the 1300s to 1521, when they were defeated by the Spanish Empire. The Aztecs, or the Mexica, who we commonly refer to as the Aztecs, the Mexica were a conquering community, and they would sort of venture out from the central region of Mexico, from the valley, and they would find communities that were good at stuff, and they would try to integrate them into the empire, and they would tax them with whatever they were good at. If some communities were good at making, for example, making bread, they would say, we tax you 100,000 pieces of bread a week or whatever. In southwestern Mexico, the Otomi Empire were perfecting the paper-making process of amate. And so the Aztecs would demand artisans deliver 500,000 sheets of papel amate as tribute, I think yearly. These papers were used in the Mexica Empire for record keeping, for story keeping, for, believe it or not, for like bureaucratic things like taxation records and stuff. And they have, when the Spanish conquer Mexico, they burn all of these records. In the periods immediately after the conquest, the Spaniards were working with scribes that had survived the conquest of the Mexica Empire, and they were working to create these codices in the similar style that they had been accustomed to, but under the patronage, supervision, and probably like being forced by the Spanish priests that they were working with. So the codices that exist today were made during that post-conquest period. Yeah, on that papel amate paper. Yeah, exactly. That papel amate paper, that tree bark paper, is the kind of paper that was used for the codex. And this is a photograph of the Codex Mendoza, which is one of the 11 codices that exist. The Huexotzinco Codex. And in the codices, they depict stories, but they're also depicting, as you can tell, Catholic imagery. That's sort of a Madonna, Mary holding Christ. And even though it was made within the first few decades after the conquest, there's already this very strong influence of Spanish Catholicism. However, continuing that tradition of that papel amate paper, that paper bark paper. In these Otomi communities, they create this paper, like I mentioned, by stripping the bark, soaking it in water, and then weaving the bark together. And then with stones, flattening it out. You have to find like a flat surface, and then you take stones to flatten out the paper. It is a process that is still produced today. If you go to Mexico to a mercado, to an artisan mercado, you'll probably find this kind of papel amate pretty widely available. The Otomi community, this empire that was producing the paper, that paper holds a really sacred space in their culture. Papel amate to the Otomi is used as a vessel for communicating with a greater plane, a higher plane, with divinity. Very frequently, the Otomi community will create these paper cutouts of deities, and they use them in rituals and in spiritual ceremonies. This piece is contemporary, meaning that it was made within the past 20, 30 years. But it's a pretty good source or a pretty good understanding of the kind of things that we can imagine the Otomi Empire would have done. And also it lays the groundwork for the eventuality of Papel Picado. Even though they're using the paper weaving technique to create those perforations had been used stylistically by indigenous communities 500 to 700 years ago. And it is pretty widely believed, or at least it's believed by many archaeologists and scholars, that we can assume that there would have been similar versions of this perforation weaving technique that would have been hung as banners for different ceremonies. The present-day celebration of Day of the Dead is a continuation and an amalgamation of Catholicism and indigenous celebrations. And there's pretty good records that say that for the version of Day of the Dead, the original version of Day of the Dead, those indigenous communities would have hung banners with these kinds of woven perforations, sort of laying the groundwork for what became Papel Picado today. These are more of this like cut version, and these, I believe, they're used for harvest rituals. So they would cut these depictions of harvest deities and use them during the harvest season or during the planting season in hopes of a better harvest. They can also be used for having people fall in love with you. Not that I've tried it, I've only heard about it. This is what Papel Picado looks like today. Papel Picado is usually done with very large stacks of tissue paper, and it's hammer and chisel. Picado, when we say something está picado, you can say like picaste fruta. Like picar is more like to chop or to perforate or to cut. So it's chopped paper. Papel Picado is a pretty widely accessible artesanía. It's almost always done by, or it should always be done by hand. And it's frequently sold in these mercado environments, these market environments. Hypercapitalization and globalization, introduction of plastic, have really, and synthetic materials, have really affected all artisan forms in Mexico. And Papel Picado is one of the bigger ones because paper decorations seem silly when you can buy like a plastic one that you can like reuse over and over again. And a lot of these artesanos, these artisans from Mexico, they've noticed a sharp drop in the appreciation and consumption of this really old style of decoration. Papel Picado would look like this at a mercado. That whole back section looks great. It's probably a ton of candy and chips and stuff. In Mexico, it would probably look like this. On the streets of Mexico, it would look something like this. Once those perforated banners are cut and designed, you would hang them on a string and hang them across usually public spaces. That kind of papel picado culture can vary from region to region in Mexico. There's some regions of Mexico that have specific beliefs associated with the colors. Very commonly, this idea that Papel Picado during Day of the Dead is like a portal for the souls of our loved ones to enter this realm is pretty common as well. But it's also sort of used, I think, generally speaking, as a decoration. Whether it be for a saint, for a holiday, for Independence Day, or just like a pretty decoration for a restaurant. I think it's very synonymously Mexican in the present. Huixarica arts. The Huichol culture, Huixarica art. Huixarica art is one of the more visually striking and I think unique art forms in Mexico. And it comes from this really interesting community, this really interesting indigenous community from the northwest region of Mexico. They come from these areas of Mexico, this northwestern area, and specifically the Sierra Madre, which is the mountain range we call the Rockies here in the States. It's called the Andes in South America. In northwest part of Mexico, it's the Sierra Madre. That mountain range goes throughout the entire continent. And Mexico is a thinner country than the United States. And so those mountains have a more pronounced presence. And it's allowed for a really interesting geographical cultural divide, or cultural development, I should say. What I mean is that in Mexico City, for example, if you drive 5 hours in any direction, you can reach the ocean, you can reach snowy peaks, you can reach a desert, you can reach like jungles with monkeys and jaguars and stuff. You can reach from Mexico City in either west or east, you can reach an ocean within like 5 to 6, 7 hours. Which is bonkers to think about from the Chicago perspective. If you drive in any direction in the United States from Chicago for 6, 7 hours, you're going to see corn and soybeans pretty much for the next 7 or 8 hours. And in Mexico, it's not the case. I've driven through roads in Mexico for like stretches of like 1 hour. And you'll see pretty sharp differences in the topography, in the vegetation. Like on a single road, you'll see a complete evergreen forest, and then you start to get to like more temperate climate. And it's really sharp and it's really interesting. That geographical possibility has also created these cultural possibilities. For example, the Huixarica, they live so isolated in the mountains of the Sierra Madre that historically we talk about them as never having been conquered by the Spanish conquistadors. They were never conquered in part because of isolation. Presumably the Spanish were tired from committing genocide in the lowlands, that they didn't go up to the mountains. But also just it's such a remote area that they were able to stay concealed. Maybe not even necessarily hiding, just because of the topography, they were managed to stay concealed. And over the course of the past 500 years, since the arrival of the Spaniards, that geographical difference has allowed this community, the Huixarica people, to maintain their traditions, their beliefs, their customs, very free of Catholicism, very free of contemporary Mexican culture. And still to this day, they speak their own language, they still follow their customs and traditions. They produce these art forms that we'll see in a second as part of these religious, spiritual processes and ceremonies. The Huixarica people, what is frequently referred to as the Huichol people, they have a very important pilgrimage that is essential for the continuation of their culture, of their belief system, of their religion. This pilgrimage is usually done on foot, as you can see in this photograph. And it's about over 500 kilometers. This route usually starts in the mountains of the northwest of Mexico, and it goes eastward towards San Luis Potosí. And in this pilgrimage, the Huixarica people, before engaging in this 500-kilometer pilgrimage, they will fast for a few days to prepare themselves mentally for the journey. Through the journey, they visit several spiritual sites that are important to their faith, to their religion, to their culture, and all with the pursuit of ending at Wirikuta, which is this sort of foundational physical moment for the Huichol faith. Upon arriving to Wirikuta, they search for a really special plant. This is a rather low resolution photograph, but this is a Huichol woman holding a very special cactus that grows in arid regions of the northwest of Mexico. Does anyone know what it is? Just kidding, you don't have to tell me. It's peyote. Peyote is a really important hallucinogenic, psychotropic plant that grows naturally and wild in Mexico, and it's like foundational to the Huichol faith and culture. The peyote, it is believed by the Huichol people, allows them to access their ancestral heritage and ancestral memories. During this pilgrimage, they walk to this space, this area of Mexico, to forage the desert, and they grab as much peyote as they can to then walk back to their homes in the northwestern region of Mexico. They use the peyote as part of these spiritual processes, where they access these these greater planes, these higher planes, and in doing so access divinity. In the consumption of peyote, they try to reach the gift of sight, nierica, which is this moment where through the use of the peyote, they can now see these like divine planes of reality, these like altered planes of reality. And it's such an important part of their faith and culture that the pilgrimage is a intangible UNESCO heritage, and the peyote plant is protected by the Mexican government for the consumption of spiritual and religious practices in Mexico. In the past 30, 40 years, indigenous spiritual practices that use naturally occurring psychotropic plants have become sort of popular amongst the general population of drug consumption. In the States, there's all these talks of trips to Central and South America for ayahuasca trips, trips to Northwest Mexico to convene with Huichol communities for peyote, all these other substances that are used throughout the world for religious ceremonies. And it's quite unfortunate because I think it creates a global cultural environment where their faith system, their belief system, their culture is sort of diminished into recreation or drug use. It's not a joke to them. It's not a fun thing for them. It's something that is essential for their understanding of themselves and their people and their culture. And it's an essential part of their like yearly plan because they do these pilgrimages every year. Through the process, through the pilgrimage, while they are engaging in this ritualistic use of peyote, they start to achieve nierica. They start to achieve this gift of sight, this ability to access this divine plane. And to do so, they commemorate those moments and those accesses by creating nierica pieces. Nierica pieces, Huichol votive art, is usually made by covering a piece of wood with wax and then using string or yarn, and in more commercial cases, small beads. They will push that material into the wax, and then that's it. There's no other protective coating that goes into it. This is sort of a close-up of that kind of processes. And this is a really famous piece from the National Museum of Anthropology and History in Mexico. This is a little bit of a close-up. This is some of the kind of art form that would be made during this spiritual pilgrimage, presumably aided by the consumption of peyote. And it has a bunch of depictions of sacred imagery, of historical imagery, allusions to their creation stories, their creation mythology. Visually, they're incredibly striking. This piece is pretty huge too. It's 48 inches by 96 inches, which sounds like not a lot, but when we consider it's made entirely out of strings that are assembled and pushed into wax, it's a pretty striking piece. Let's explore some of those symbols a bit closer. Nierica, this moment of achieving this gift of sight, is usually highlighted in pieces or recognized in pieces with these concentric circle figures. Those circles, or the word nierica, I should say, this device for seeing in the pieces is usually detailed that way, but it can also be used to refer to physical, tangible things. So sometimes mirrors would be called niericas, and very frequently what are called God's eyes. These crosses with the rhombus shape of strings, those are produced by the Huichol community as well, and are versions of ñericas, they're versions of these tools to harness the gift of sight. Of course, hikuri, the peyote plant. The peyote plant is not just this substance that they consume to achieve this greater plane. This is a quote from a website by the National Anthropology and History Museum from Mexico. Peyote was born when the deer Tamatsi, our elder brother, the first to reach the east, obtained the gift of sight, or ñerica. At the moment, his heart, this deer's heart, was transformed into a peyote, and he gave himself to the first hunters. They ate him and reached ñerica. From the tracks left by this first deer in the sacred desert of Wirikuta, where were born all the other peyote plants, and they reproduced thanks to the deer and his self-sacrifice. So at the formational moments in the creation myth of the Wirikuta people, there is this sacred deer who's being pursued by the first hunters of mankind. They corner this deer, and the deer, instead of putting up a fight, he sacrifices himself for the continuation of humanity. Upon his sacrifice, his heart turns into a peyote plant, and these hunters consume the heart, now a peyote plant, and achieve the gift of sight that this first deer had. When they achieve the gift of sight, this blue deer appears, and as he walks away from the hunters, his footsteps grow the peyote plant in this site, Wirikuta, where they go for the pilgrimage every year. So, like I mentioned, the symbolism represents not only these tangible things, but it's such an intense narrative in history, and it's done yearly. Deer are like sacred to the Wirikuta people. So there's deer antlers that are frequently depicted in pieces. The deer are oftentimes referred to as their older brothers, and it's a recognition of this sacrifice committed by the first deer at the foundation of their culture. And serpents are associated with the aquatic world below, sort of like an underworld, with the west, with darkness, femininity, and fertility. An enormous two-headed serpent lives in the sea surrounding Earth. So serpents are frequently depicted in the pieces. There is a bunch of other symbols in these pieces, of course, but those are the ones that I chose to highlight. At the National Museum of Mexican Art, we have a permanent collection, and in our permanent collection, we have this gigantic piece created by these Huixarica people from the state of Zacatecas. This is the second room in our permanent exhibit called Nuestras Historias, Our Stories. And that gigantic piece that you can see in that background there, it is a piece created in 2003. It's titled The New Awakening, and it is a piece not made with string, but made with beads, with tiny chaquira beads. Chaquira beads are these glass or plastic manufactured beads that are used by the Huixarica people for the votive art processes in lieu of string. This piece that we have at the National Museum of Mexican Art, as you saw in the previous picture, hopefully you got a sense of the scale. It's about 8 feet tall and 10 feet wide. And it is made of 80 planks of wood. Each one of these squares is a plank of wood, about a foot by a foot. Really 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. Let's not get into that, I guess. And it depicts a lot of these sacred symbols like we saw in the previous piece. It is made entirely of chaquira beads. It was made by a group of 10 artisans over the course of 18 months, and it is estimated to have been made with about 1.8 million beads. These are a little bit of close-ups to some of that symbol. We can see, of course, that deer. We can see that ñerica, that seeing eye device in the center. We can see, of course, other flora and fauna and other representations of their creation myths, like the blue deer, like this older brother deer character. That two-headed snake that lives in the oceans that surround the edge of the world are depicted. And this close-up, I think, is a better visual for those little tiny beads that these pieces are created of. And like I mentioned, at the museum, National Museum of Mexican Art, free admission, Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 5. Come check it out. That's a great question. Did they make that piece specifically for the museum? Yes, they did. The piece that we have, the New Awakening, is one of three pieces that were made to this scale. We have one here in Pilsen, in the National Museum of Mexican Art. There's one in Zacatecas, in the capital of Zacatecas, in another art museum. And the third one is in, any guesses, drumroll, Paris, France. It was made in collaboration with the Louvre, I believe. But they were direct commissions. So the museum in Zacatecas sort of organizes the relationships that community, this Huixárica community from Zacatecas, they wanted to create these pieces on a large scale, and the museum commissioned them, so they were paid directly. However, these Huixárica people, they don't navigate the peso, they don't use money. Or at least they didn't in the early 2000s. And so the museum had to broker a deal with the museum in Mexico, where we paid X amounts of money, and that museum then used that money to help that community build some infrastructure, get tools for farming, and things that community requested. I don't know how true this is, but I was told the people from Paris never paid them. I don't know how true that is. This piece, like I mentioned, lives at our museum. It's part of our permanent collection. And it's pretty stunning. Up close, it's kind of bonkers. I mean, in this piece, you can sort of see the beadwork, but when you get close in person, it's really an intense visual. Patterns are not just decoration. They are stories, beliefs, and identities made visible. The reason I thought these three art forms were an interesting thing to speak about together is because although they are visually different, they have these snippets of the greater Mexican narrative. The Talavera Poblana, for example, is such a perfect example of what colonization means in the long term. The cultural exchange that occurs after the arrival of the Spanish to Mexico is not one-sided, and it's not just Spain to Mexico. It's everything that Spain brought with them, and everything that Spain was in contact with came to Mexico. When we talk about the Catholic conquest or the Spanish conquest of Mexico, it's difficult to mention in one sentence, in one breath, that the Spanish also brought Islamic culture with them. They brought Jewish cultures with them. They brought African people by force via the transatlantic slave trade. And all of those cultures came via these boats and landed in the eastern coast of Mexico. And it wasn't just Spanish Catholicism. The artwork that we can see today in Mexico, although it can be very pretty decorations at Mexican restaurants like Papel Picado, they don't happen in a vacuum, and they don't happen overnight. They happen over the course of these incredible moments of human history where the world shrunk very rapidly and very quickly. The Talavera to me is a great example of globalization and what that means today. The Papel Picado, I think, is a really funny moment of parallel histories. The indigenous communities already had a version of that kind of tradition going on before the Spanish arrival. And of course, in China, in Europe, there was already an understanding of cut paper decorations. And when the conquest occurs, they both sort of continue together. Those two divergent paths, or two separate paths, become one. And of course, the Huichol artwork, the Huixárica people artwork, those votive paintings, they're a really good example of what it means to create artwork for votive purposes, for religious purposes, that then become absorbed by the popular culture. I think when we see that kind of artwork, the majority of people don't think of the process and the spirituality that goes into it, but it's something that's like essential to the Huichol, to the Huixárica people and culture. Contemporary takes on these traditions. Of course, Mexico is an ever-changing country, an ever-changing culture, and there's a lot of artists in the present that are looking back at the culture and history for their contemporary practices. Talavera Poblana, for example, is sometimes called, unfortunately, a dying art form. The introduction of manufactured goods, the introduction of screen printing processes, and all these sort of things render these like sort of painstakingly long processes difficult for young people and young artists to want to navigate. And so to mitigate that, there's shops like Uriarte, which are one of the larger workshops that are recognized by this guild in Puebla, that offer residencies to contemporary artists. They'll teach you the tradition, the craft. They'll teach you the process of going to the mountains, digging out these 3 different types of soil, letting them sit in water for like 4 days, sifting it, cleaning it, cooking it once, varnishing it white, cooking it again, painting it blue, and then cooking it a 3rd time to reach this incredible material. By the way, I hate this piece, and I put it in the presentation because I hated it so much, if that makes sense to people. There's an artist called Eduardo Sarabia, who does not use the process of Talavera, but he uses the aesthetics of Talavera to create work that speaks about the opulence of organized crime in Mexico, and this suggestion of when we look at Talavera traditionally, we see all of these symbols that are sort of ingrained in Mexican culture. What is that going to look like when the symbols of organized crime and violence are ingrained in the Mexican visual lexicon? I really like his work. Papel Picado is frequently used by Mexican artists, but Mexican American artists as well. Carmen Lomas Garza is an artist from the Southwest, who uses these papel picado formats as she calls them, these windows into her history, into her heritage, into her life. This is a piece in airport. Which airport it is, I forgot. I want to say somewhere in Colorado or Texas, somewhere over there. I don't remember. But it's this contemporary take on the aesthetics of papel picado. That piece was probably made by Carmen Lomas Garza as a piece of paper. She probably scanned it, created a vector, and then carved it out of metal. And now it hangs and sits on this incredibly public space. Artists like Catalina Delgado Trunk, they use that papel picado process, but of course blending it with contemporary visuals or with their personal heritage and story. That piece on the left is a depiction of Santa Lucia, Saint Lucy, who is this saint whose eyes were, I don't remember she gouged her own eyes out or her eyes were gouged out, but she's always depicted holding her own eyes on a little plate. Saint Lucy, one of my favorite saints. If you are unfamiliar with Catholicism, check out Saint Lucy and Saint Bartholomew. They're a good place to start. This contemporary take on papel picado uses the traditional processes, but incorporates maybe more personal overtones or undertones, and perhaps even more less traditional aesthetics and visuals. The Margaret Alarcon's work, Kika Alarcon's work, I really enjoy because she incorporates not only photography into the papel picado, but papel mate. So she's taking all of those, that cultural wealth and cultural knowledge that exists in the art form of papel picado, and she's using it for these incredibly intimate, very contemporary takes on the material, but also on her own artwork. I think they're awesome pieces. And of course, the Huixarica people, this votive painting that they do in the past 30 to 40 years gained some traction in the art world and community. In the past 10 to 20 years, a lot of those communities that use the peyote and this pilgrimage and the votive painting art form, they transition from string to the beads, the Shakira beads. And sometimes when we speak about that work, we speak about the string work, that yarn painting, as being more of the spiritual painting, more of the votive painting, and this bead work tends to be a little bit more commercial. It is an interesting approach and technique that these Huixarica communities have of preservation. This idea that by exposing their culture to the wider art world, their culture will then be seen by many, and hopefully they can maintain this isolation and preservation of culture. It's this preservation through exposure sort of approach. As a result of that, in the past 20 to 30 years, Huixarica artwork has become one of the many synonymous visual languages of Mexican art form. And if you're unfamiliar with punch buggies or with the Beetle. Mexico loved the Beetle. It was one of the most sold cars in history in Mexico. And this is like a super Mexican moment. But also in the contemporary moments, Formula One is this huge like international event, and to introduce Mexico to the Formula One global audience, and also to introduce Formula One to the Mexican audience. The Formula One commission based in Mexico commissioned Wixárika artists to cover this Formula One car in beads, and it's been done several times. The Formula One race happens every year in Mexico City, and it's been done a couple times. And that is it. Thank you all so much for the presentation. Yes. Any questions, concerns? If you have questions, I'll drink some water in the meantime. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, hopefully the notion of the wealth of information that goes into any everyday pattern came across in the presentation. But I think it's interesting to consider how easy it is to forget the wealth of culture and information that goes into visuals that we see frequently. It's easy for me to talk about that work from Mexico, but we do that all the time here in the United States as well. Sometimes I talk about like how blue jeans 100 years ago were like synonymous with like workforce and work culture, and now like my little brother wears blue jeans to sleep sometimes because they're so soft and comfortable. But I mean that change of what symbols can mean and what symbols can do, I think is important to sometimes take a step back and look at them. But yeah, thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed it.